I didn't raise my voice when my sister laughed at me. I didn't defend myself when her friends stared amused as she turned my life into a joke. I stood there quiet while she listed my failures like punchlines, my job, my past, my choices, each one carefully exaggerated to make her look bigger and me look smaller. What hurt wasn't just the words, it was how confident she was that nothing would come of it. She believed humiliation was permanent. She believed silence meant weakness. I remember the room clearly, the sound of glasses clinking, the smell of perfume, the way the laughter lingered even after I walked away. I went home that night carrying something heavy, something old. Not anger, not revenge, just the weight of years spent being underestimated. She went to bed thinking she'd won. By morning, the truth she never bothered to ask about would be impossible to ignore. And the sister who mocked me in public would be the one knocking on my door, voice shaking, dignity gone, begging me to listen. If you're watching from somewhere in the world right now, take a moment to comment your location and local time. I read more of them than you think. And if stories about quiet endurance and delayed justice speak to you, consider subscribing. You're not alone here. I grew up learning how to stay small. In our family, that skill mattered more than anything else, more than grades, more than ambition, more than honesty. My parents never said it out loud, but the hierarchy was clear. My sister Emily was the sun. Everything revolved around her. Her mood set the temperature of the house. Her achievements were framed and hung. Her mistakes were explained away before they ever reached the dinner table. I was the background noise. We lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in the Midwest, the kind with trimmed lawns and neighbors who waved but never asked questions. On the outside, we looked stable, comfortable, the kind of family people assumed had no real problems. My dad worked a salaried management job. My mom stayed busy with community groups and appearances. Emily was always going places, as people like to say. I was just there. From a young age, I learned how comparisons worked in our house. Emily was naturally confident. I was too sensitive. Emily was bold. I was reserved. Emily spoke her mind. I should know when to keep quiet. By the time I reached my teens, silence felt safer than honesty. When I did well in school, it was treated like a pleasant surprise. When Emily did anything at all, it was expected and celebrated. Family dinners often turned into highlight reels of her life, while mine passed unnoticed. If I tried to contribute, the conversation would drift away before I finished my sentence. I don't think Emily was born cruel. I think she learned slowly that the world would bend for her, that attention was guaranteed, that consequences were optional. I learned the opposite. After high school, our paths diverged in ways that only deepened the gap between us. Emily went to a private college with help from our parents. Tuition, housing, even a monthly allowance handled quietly, efficiently. When she struggled with classes, tutors were hired. When she switched majors, no one complained about wasted money. I went to a state school an hour away. I worked part-time, then full-time. I took out loans. When I mentioned how hard it was to balance everything, my parents reminded me how independent I was. They said it like praise, but it felt like distance. Still, I didn't resent Emily. Not openly. I told myself this was just how families worked. Someone had to be the strong one. Someone had to adapt. I convinced myself that if I stayed patient long enough, if I proved myself quietly, things would even out. They didn't. After college, Emily's life stayed loud. New friends, new jobs. Social media filled with smiling photos and captions about hard work paying off. Mine stayed small and contained. I took a steady job that paid the bills. I lived modestly. I kept my head down. When family gatherings happened, I showed up on time, smiled politely, and left early. Emily, on the other hand, loved an audience. She had a way of telling stories that always ended with her looking impressive and someone else looking foolish. Sometimes that someone was an old coworker, sometimes an ex, sometimes slowly, and more often it was me. She'd laugh while recounting my weird habits, my lack of ambition, my sad little routines. People laughed with her, assuming it was harmless sibling teasing. I never corrected her. Not because what she said was true, but because challenging her in public always made things worse. She'd roll her eyes, call me dramatic, and my parents would later suggest I lighten up. So I learned to absorb it, to nod, to let her version of me exist unchallenged. What Emily didn't realize, what no one ever asked about, was that my quiet life wasn't empty. It was deliberate. While she performed, I paid attention. While she dismissed details, I remembered them. While she joked, I listened. And over the years, I noticed patterns, small inconsistencies, offhand comments that didn't line up, decisions made on my behalf without discussion, paperwork I was asked to sign without explanation, responsibilities quietly shifted onto me because you're reliable. I didn't push back. I filed things away in my mind, in folders, in emails I never deleted. Not because I planned to use them, because I didn't have the luxury of being careless. By the time of that night, the night she shamed me in front of her friends, I already understood my place in the family narrative. I was the convenient contrast, the one who made her look brighter by comparison, the one whose silence could always be mistaken for agreement. Emily invited me to that gathering like it was an afterthought, a casual text. "We're having people over. You should come." No warmth, no reason. I almost declined, but habit pulled me there anyway. Showing up had become automatic like muscle memory. I didn't know she'd decided I would be part of the entertainment. Standing in that room, listening to her laugh while reshaping my life into something smaller, I felt the familiar instinct to disappear. But underneath it was something new. Not anger, not even sadness. Clarity. I finally understood that waiting to be seen wasn't patience. It was surrender. And I had already surrendered enough. That night didn't change who I was. It revealed who she thought I would always be. And for the first time, I knew quietly, unmistakably, that she was wrong. The gathering itself wasn't supposed to mean anything. That's what I told myself as I parked a few houses down and sat in my car longer than necessary, watching people come and go. Emily had chosen a trendy rental townhouse closer to the city, open floor plan, tall windows, the kind of place designed to feel impressive even when it wasn't lived in yet. Music floated through the open door. Laughter spilled out easily, confidently. Her kind of environment. I almost left. But years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. So I locked the car, smoothed my jacket, and walked in like I always did, quiet, unobtrusive, prepared to take up as little space as possible. Emily barely looked at me when I arrived. She was in the center of the room, drink in hand, surrounded by people who clearly admired her. She introduced me with a quick gesture, my name tossed out like an accessory. "That's my sibling," she said, smiling. No context, no warmth, just enough acknowledgement to avoid appearing rude. I nodded, offered polite hellos, and drifted toward the edge of the room. At first, everything felt manageable. Conversations overlapped. People talked about work, travel, weekend plans. I listened more than I spoke. That was normal. A few of Emily's friends glanced at me with mild curiosity, then lost interest when I didn't compete for attention. I didn't mind. Blending in had always been my strength, but I noticed Emily watching me. Not with concern, with calculation. It started subtly. Someone mentioned careers, and Emily laughed, waving her hand dismissively. "Oh, you should hear what my sibling does," she said. "It's unique." The word lingered, sharpened by tone. People leaned in. I felt their eyes turn toward me. I smiled, non-committal, hoping it would pass. It didn't. She went on, embellishing details she barely understood. She talked about my job as if it were a failed experiment, instead of a deliberate choice. She joked about my quietness, framing it as social awkwardness. Each comment landed softly enough to seem harmless, but together they formed a picture I didn't recognize and one I hadn't consented to. Laughter followed her words. Not cruel laughter. Worse, casual laughter. The kind that assumes everyone is in on the joke. I felt heat rise to my face, but I stayed still. I focused on my breathing. I reminded myself that reacting would only give her more material. That correcting her would make me look defensive. That silence at least preserved some dignity. Emily took that silence as permission. She grew bolder. She shared a story from years ago, something private, something she'd been asked not to repeat. She twisted it into a punchline, leaving out context, intention, growth. Her friends laughed louder this time. Someone shook their head sympathetically in my direction, as if I were exactly the person she'd described. I realized then that this wasn't accidental. She had rehearsed this version of me. Standing there, I felt strangely detached, as if I were watching the scene from outside myself. I saw how easily narratives are shaped when one person controls the microphone. I saw how little it mattered that I'd lived the truth when her performance was more entertaining. I excused myself quietly and stepped outside for air. The night was cool. The city hummed distantly. I leaned against the railing and let the noise inside fade. My hands were steady. My heart wasn't racing. What I felt wasn't panic or rage, it was a slow, sinking understanding. This was who Emily believed she was in relation to me. Above, untouchable, entitled to my story as long as it served her. I considered leaving without saying goodbye, but something kept me there. Not hope, not obligation. Curiosity. I wanted to see how far she would go when she thought there were no consequences. When I went back inside, the energy had shifted. Emily was fully engaged now, telling another story, this one about family, about growing up with responsibility, about how hard it was to always be the capable one. She spoke as if I weren't standing 10 feet away. Her friends listened intently. Someone nodded. Someone murmured agreement. Emily glanced at me briefly, her eyes flicking over my face like a challenge. I didn't rise to it. Instead, I did something she never expected. I listened. I listened closely to what she said, to what she avoided, to the assumptions buried beneath her jokes. I noticed how often she spoke in absolutes, how confidently she attributed motives to me without ever asking, how she presented opinions as facts. And I noticed something else too. She was sloppy. Details blurred where they shouldn't have. Timelines overlapped incorrectly. Responsibilities, she claimed, didn't match reality. To her friends, it didn't matter. But to someone who had lived through those moments and kept records, it stood out. At one point, someone asked me directly if what Emily said was true. The room quieted slightly. A dozen eyes turned toward me. I could have corrected everything right then. I could have defended myself. I didn't. I smiled politely and said, "Everyone sees things differently." Emily laughed, relieved. Her friends chuckled, satisfied. The moment passed, but something important had shifted. In choosing not to speak, I wasn't surrendering. I was refusing to play the role she'd written for me. I wasn't denying the truth, I was preserving it. When I finally left, no one stopped me. Emily didn't notice, or pretended not to. I walked to my car under the soft glow of streetlights, the echoes of laughter still faintly audible behind me. I sat in the driver's seat and let the door close gently. That was when the weight of the evening settled fully, not as pain, but as resolve. Because while Emily had spent the night rewriting my past for entertainment, she had unknowingly exposed her own carelessness. She had shown me exactly how confident she was that I would never challenge her. And confidence like that leaves blind spots. I drove home in silence, replaying everything not emotionally, but methodically. Each comment, each exaggeration, each assumption she'd made out loud. She believed humiliation was power. She didn't realize it was evidence. I thought the worst part of that night was already behind me. I was wrong. The real humiliation didn't happen while I was still inside the townhouse, standing quietly near the edge of the room. It happened when Emily decided she hadn't gone far enough yet, when she realized the attention was fading and reached for something sharper. I learned later that this was always her pattern. When admiration dipped, she escalated. I had just stepped back inside to grab my coat when I heard my name again. Louder this time. Deliberate. The music lowered slightly, either by coincidence or instinct. Emily turned toward me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Wait," she said, raising her glass. "Before you go, there's one more thing I have to tell them." The room stilled. Conversations paused mid-sentence. I felt every pair of eyes move toward us, drawn by the promise of drama. Emily had always known how to command a moment. I stopped walking. Part of me hoped she would hesitate, that she'd realize she was crossing a line she couldn't step back from. She didn't. She began telling a story she had no right to tell. It was something deeply personal, something that had happened years ago during a difficult period of my life. A moment I had shared with my parents in confidence. A moment that had shaped how I chose to live afterward. Emily hadn't been part of it. She'd overheard fragments, filled in the rest with assumptions. And now she presented it as entertainment. She framed it as a funny family story. She stripped away context. She exaggerated my vulnerability. She turned a painful decision into a punchline. Her voice stayed light, amused, as if she were describing someone else entirely. People laughed. Not all of them. Some looked uncomfortable, but no one stopped her. No one questioned whether this was appropriate. In rooms like that, momentum matters more than morality. I stood there, my coat half on my hands, suddenly heavy at my sides. This wasn't teasing anymore. This wasn't casual disrespect. This was exposure. Public, intentional, irreversible. I felt my chest tighten, not from anger, but from something closer to grief. Grief for the illusion that my silence had ever been protecting me. Grief for the version of Emily I had kept hoping existed somewhere beneath the performance. She finished the story with a flourish, laughing at her own delivery. I mean, can you imagine? She said, shaking her head. I still don't know how they survive like that. She looked at me then. Really looked. Waiting for a reaction. Waiting for me to crack, to lash out, to prove her narrative correct. I didn't give her that satisfaction. I met her gaze calmly. I felt my face settle into stillness, not blank, not cold. Controlled. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I didn't speak. The silence stretched. For a brief moment, discomfort crept into the room. Someone cleared their throat. Someone shifted their weight. Emily's smile faltered just slightly, as if she hadn't expected nothing to happen. Then she laughed again louder, forcing the mood back into place. I took that moment to leave. I walked past her without a word. I didn't rush. I didn't look back. I could feel her eyes on me as I crossed the threshold, but I kept going, my movements steady and deliberate. Outside, the door closed behind me with a soft click. That sound felt final. I stood on the sidewalk longer than I meant to, breathing in the night air, letting the cold settle my thoughts. My phone buzzed in my pocket, messages already coming in. A few from extended family members who'd heard something through the grapevine. One from my mother asking vaguely if everything was okay. I didn't respond. Because for the first time the question wasn't whether I was okay, it was whether I was done. I drove home slowly, replaying the scene not emotionally but analytically. I thought about how confidently Emily had spoken, how certain she was that I would absorb the blow the way I always had, how secure she felt in the belief that nothing would come of it. That belief hadn't come from nowhere. It had been reinforced for years. Every time my parents brushed off her comments as just how she is. Every time I was encouraged to be the bigger person. Every time my silence was mistaken for acceptance. By the time I pulled into my driveway, something inside me had settled into place. Not anger, not vengeance. Finality. I went inside, set my keys down, and sat at the kitchen table without turning on the lights. The house was quiet, safe, neutral. I stayed there for a long time, letting the weight of the evening fully land. Then I stood up and walked to my home office. I opened a drawer I rarely touched. Inside were folders, physical ones neatly labeled. Documents I'd kept over the years without knowing exactly when I might need them. Agreements, emails, copies of forms, notes written after conversations that felt off at the time. Nothing illegal, nothing stolen. Everything obtained honestly, quietly, and with reason. I hadn't collected them out of malice. I had collected them because I had learned early on that no one else was going to keep track for me. As I spread a few of the papers out on the desk, patterns became clearer than they ever had before. Things I'd dismissed as misunderstandings aligned into something more deliberate. Responsibilities shifted onto me without acknowledgement. Benefits claimed by Emily that didn't fully belong to her. Decisions made for the family that somehow always favored one person. And now, after tonight, those patterns mattered. Because Emily hadn't just embarrassed me. She had put our family's private narrative on display. She had assumed that the story she told was the only one that existed. She had been wrong. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was spiraling, but because my mind was working, organizing, connecting, preparing. By the time the sky began to lighten, I felt strangely calm. Emily had taken something from me in public, but in doing so, she had given me clarity. And clarity, I was learning, was far more powerful than outrage. By the time morning came, the house felt different, not quieter, not heavier, sharper. Sunlight crept across the kitchen floor as I made coffee and stood there unmoving, watching steam rise from the mug. I hadn't slept much, but I didn't feel tired. My thoughts were organized in a way they'd never been before, like files finally placed in the right order. Emily still didn't know what she'd done. That was the strange part. She believed the damage ended when I walked out the door. In her mind, humiliation was a closed loop, something delivered, absorbed, forgotten. She had no reason to think otherwise. History supported her confidence. What she didn't know, what no one in my family had ever taken the time to ask, was how carefully I'd learned to pay attention. Years earlier, I'd started noticing how often I was asked to handle things. Paperwork, follow-ups, administrative details no one else wanted to deal with. My parents trusted me because I was responsible. Emily avoided those tasks because they were boring, so they landed with me. At first, I didn't question it. Families divide labor in uneven ways all the time. But over time, patterns emerged that didn't sit right. Documents that bore my name in places it shouldn't have been. Emails where decisions were made on my behalf after the fact. financial responsibilities quietly transferred with the assumption that I would absorb them without complaint. I did absorb them, but I also saved everything. Not obsessively, not dramatically, just methodically. I kept copies of emails that made me uncomfortable. I downloaded statements before access was updated. I took notes after conversations where something felt off. I told myself it was just good practice, being organized, being prepared. I didn't imagine I'd ever need to prove anything. Yet as I sat there that morning, I realized something important. Emily's story from the night before hadn't just been cruel. It had been inaccurate. And inaccuracies matter when they're spoken confidently and publicly. She had claimed responsibility for things she hadn't done. She had implied ownership where there was shared obligation. She had portrayed me as dependent when the reality was far more complex. And those weren't opinions. They were verifiable statements. I carried my coffee into the office and opened my laptop. I didn't rush. There was no panic in my movements, just intention. I began pulling up files I hadn't looked at in years. Contracts, records, correspondence. Each one told a small piece of a larger story. Taken alone, none of it was dramatic. Taken together, it was undeniable. There were documents showing that I had been listed as the responsible party on certain financial arrangements, while Emily publicly claimed credit. There were email chains where concerns I'd raised were dismissed only to resurface later under her name. There were timestamps, signatures, account numbers, mundane details that carried weight precisely because they weren't emotional. I thought about the room full of people from the night before, about how easily they had laughed, trusting Emily's confidence more than my silence. I didn't blame them. Most people believe the person who speaks first loudest and with the least hesitation. Emily had mastered that skill. What she hadn't mastered was accuracy. I reached out to a professional contact I'd worked with before, someone whose role required discretion, someone who dealt in facts rather than family dynamics. I didn't explain everything. I didn't dramatize. I simply asked a few careful questions. The response came back measured and clear. Yes, certain representations mattered. Yes, public statements could have implications. Yes, documentation would be essential if things escalated. I leaned back in my chair and let that sink in. This wasn't about revenge. I wasn't interested in embarrassing Emily the way she had embarrassed me. I didn't want an audience. I wanted alignment between truth and consequence. I checked my phone. Missed messages had piled up overnight. A few from friends who'd heard something vague. Another from my mother, more direct this time. Your sister is upset. She says you left abruptly. I didn't respond. For once, I wasn't interested in managing anyone else's discomfort. Late that morning, Emily finally reached out. Her message was casual, almost playful. Hey, last night got a little out of hand. You okay? I stared at the screen for a long time. There it was, the assumption that my silence meant forgiveness was already in progress. That any tension could be smoothed over with a light check-in, a vague acknowledgement, and time. I didn't answer. Instead, I forwarded a single document to myself, a summary I'd prepared, quietly, carefully laying out the discrepancies between what Emily had claimed publicly and what the records showed. No commentary, no accusation, just facts arranged in sequence. I wasn't ready to send it to anyone else yet, but I was ready to stop pretending it didn't exist. As the morning wore on, my phone rang again. This time it was my father. His voice was tight, controlled in the way it always was when conflict threatened to become visible. Your sister says something's wrong, he said. She feels like you're pulling away. I listened, without interrupting. She didn't mean to hurt you, he added. You know how she is. I almost smiled at the familiarity of the phrase. I told him calmly that I needed some space, that I wasn't angry, that I just needed time. He didn't push. He rarely did when the conversation wasn't centered on Emily's needs. After we hung up, I felt lighter, not because anyone had understood me, but because I hadn't explained myself. I hadn't defended my feelings or minimized them for someone else's comfort. That too was new. By early afternoon, the tone of the messages began to change. Emily's texts lost their casual edge. One asked why I wasn't responding. Another suggested we talk before this turns into something bigger. I didn't reply, because something had already turned. Emily had spent years shaping a narrative where she was the capable one, and I was the quiet afterthought. She'd told it often enough that even she believed it completely. But the version she told her friends the night before hadn't just been unkind, it had been reckless. She had spoken with certainty about things she'd never verified, And now, the certainty was cracking. I closed my laptop and stepped outside for a moment, letting the afternoon air clear my head. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindictive. I felt steady. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to Emily's actions. I wasn't adjusting myself to fit her version of events. I was simply standing still, holding the truth without offering it up prematurely. She would come looking for it soon enough. Because lies don't unravel when they're challenged. They unravel when they're examined. And Emily had never bothered to examine anything she didn't think could touch her. That night, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't send the documents. I didn't demand an apology. I didn't announce boundaries or deliver speeches I'd rehearsed in my head years ago. I did none of the things people expect when they imagine someone finally standing up for themselves. Instead, I prepared. There's a quiet kind of resolve that doesn't look like strength from the outside. It looks like stillness, like restraint, like someone doing very little, when in reality they are choosing every move with care. I ordered takeout and ate slowly at the kitchen table, the house dim and peaceful around me. I washed the dishes immediately after dried them, put them away. Familiar routines grounded me. They reminded me that my life didn't revolve around Emily's moods or my family's expectations, no matter how much I'd once believed it did. After dinner, I sat down with a notebook and wrote out a timeline. Not emotions, not grievances, dates, conversations, decisions. I noted when responsibilities had shifted onto me without discussion. When my name appeared on documents I hadn't fully been briefed on. When Emily had begun speaking publicly about things she'd never actually handled. I cross-referenced emails, contracts, and messages marking where narratives diverged from facts. The process was slow, almost meditative. Each entry sharpened my understanding of what had really been happening over the years. This wasn't just about one humiliating night. That night had only exposed something much older, an imbalance that had gone unchallenged because it benefited the people in power. And Emily had always been comfortable with power. Around midnight, I received another message from her. This one wasn't playful or concerned. It was irritated. "You're being dramatic," she wrote. "We need to talk like adults." I set the phone face down. I wasn't being dramatic. I was being deliberate. And there was a difference she had never learned to recognize. I slept for a few hours, waking just before dawn. The sky outside was pale and quiet, the world in that brief space between night and morning when everything feels possible and unresolved at the same time. I made coffee again, sat by the window and reviewed my notes one last time. By then, my decision was clear. I wouldn't confront Emily directly, not yet. Direct confrontations had always favored her. She thrived in emotional exchanges, in moments where volume and confidence mattered more than substance. If I went to her with accusations, she would deflect, minimize, and enlist my parents before the conversation was even over. I needed neutrality. I needed someone who had no history with our family dynamics, someone who would look at what I had without filtering it through love, loyalty, or guilt. So that morning, after the city fully woke up, I made a call. The person on the other end listened without interrupting as I explained the situation in plain terms. I didn't mention the party. I didn't talk about humiliation. I described discrepancies, responsibilities, public claims that didn't align with records. I asked what options existed, not emotionally but procedurally. The answer wasn't dramatic, but it was significant. Yes, the situation warranted review. Yes, documentation mattered. Yes, there were steps that could be taken to clarify accountability, steps that would involve formal communication. Formal. That word stayed with me after the call ended. Formal meant no raised voices, no selective memory, no rewriting events after the fact. Formal meant paper trails, timelines, and clear language. It meant the truth wouldn't belong to whoever spoke loudest. It meant Emily wouldn't control the narrative anymore. Later that morning, my phone rang again. This time it was my mother. "She didn't sleep," she said without greeting. "She's upset. She feels like you're punishing her." I listened, letting the familiar script unfold. My mother spoke about family unity, about misunderstandings, about how things weren't meant to be taken so seriously. She urged me to talk to Emily, to reassure her, to smooth things over. I waited until she finished. "I'm not punishing anyone," I said calmly. "I'm just not engaging right now." There was a pause. My mother wasn't used to that response. I was usually the one who explained, softened, apologized sometimes, for things I hadn't done. "Well," she said, "finally, this doesn't have to turn into something bigger." I didn't argue. I didn't agree. I simply said, "I'll reach out when I'm ready." After the call, I noticed something unexpected. I didn't feel guilty. For years, guilt had been my default emotion whenever I didn't prioritize Emily's comfort. It was how the system maintained itself. But now, with my decision made, that guilt had lost its grip. It felt distant, like an echo from a room I'd already left. The rest of the day passed quietly. I went to work. I answered emails. I completed tasks. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. Emily sent one final message that afternoon. This one was shorter, sharper. "If you're going to make this a thing, just say it." I read it once. Then I deleted it. Because I wasn't making this a thing. I was letting the truth do what it always does when it's no longer ignored. That evening, I organized the documents into a single digital folder and secured it. I drafted a brief, neutral summary, no blame, no emotion, just a statement of facts and questions that required answers. I didn't send it yet, but it was ready. For the first time, I felt prepared rather than reactive. Emily had built her confidence on the assumption that I would always stay silent. That assumption had protected her from scrutiny, from correction, from consequence. But silence, I was learning, isn't the same as absence. It's presence without performance. And when presence is paired with preparation, it becomes something else entirely. By the time I went to bed that night, I knew the next step would change the dynamic permanently. There would be no going back to how things were, no more casual dismissals, no more jokes at my expense that went unchallenged by reality. Emily had humiliated me in public. What she didn't understand was that she had done it at the exact moment I was finally ready to stop absorbing and start aligning. Not with anger, with truth. The shift didn't announce itself with drama. There was no explosive confrontation, no tearful confession, no moment where Emily suddenly realized she'd gone too far. Instead, the change arrived quietly through procedure, through steps that couldn't be undone with charm or dismissed as overreaction. Early the next morning, I sent the email. It was brief, neutral, addressed to the appropriate office with one professional copied in. No family members, no emotional language. Just a request for clarification regarding certain responsibilities and representations that appeared inconsistent across records. I attached the documents. Then I closed my laptop and went about my day. That was the hardest part, continuing to live normally while something irreversible had been set in motion. I went to work. I attended meetings. I answered questions that had nothing to do with my family. On the surface, I was calm. Inside, I felt a steady pressure, like the quiet before a storm that didn't need thunder to be devastating. By mid-morning, my phone started vibrating again. Emily. 3 missed calls in a row. Then a message. "Why is someone asking me questions about things that don't concern you?" I didn't reply. Because for the first time, the questions didn't come from me. They came from someone who had no interest in our history, no patience for sibling dynamics, and no reason to protect Emily's image. They came from a place where facts mattered more than confidence. Within hours, the tone shifted. My mother called again, her voice tighter than before. "Did you contact someone?" she asked carefully, as if choosing the wrong word might detonate something. "I asked for clarification," I said. "About things that involve me." She went quiet. "I thought this was just about hurt feelings," she said finally. "It isn't," I replied. "It never was." That was when I realized how deeply my family had misunderstood me, not just recently, but always. They thought my silence meant I didn't see what was happening, that my patience meant I lacked awareness. They had mistaken restraint for ignorance, Emily especially. By early afternoon, I received confirmation that the review had begun. Nothing accusatory. Nothing final. Just acknowledgement that the questions raised were valid and would require responses. Documentation would be examined. Statements would be verified. Timelines would be cross-checked. Process. Emily hated process. She called again. This time I answered. "What are you doing?" she demanded, skipping any pretense of concern. "Why are people suddenly asking me about paperwork from years ago?" I let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking. "I didn't make them ask," I said calmly. "I just answered questions when they came up." "That's not an answer," she snapped. "You know this makes me look bad." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how revealing it was. Not once did she ask if what she'd said was wrong. Not once did she question whether her public version of events had been accurate. Her concern wasn't truth. It was appearance. "I didn't say anything about how you look," I replied. "I just shared what I had." She scoffed. "You're overreacting." This is what I mean, you always do this. You take things too seriously. I thought about the night before, about the laughter, about the confidence with which she'd told my story like it belonged to her. I didn't start this, I said evenly. But I'm not stopping it. She went quiet. For a brief moment, I wondered if she was finally calculating, replaying what she'd said, trying to remember details she'd glossed over, trying to reconcile confidence with uncertainty. Then her voice came back lower now. You didn't have to go this far. I ended the call. Because what she meant was, you didn't have to remove my control. The rest of the day unfolded in fragments, emails requesting clarification, follow-up questions phrased politely, but firmly acknowledgments of receipt. Each one tightened the situation just a little more. Not dramatically, methodically. Emily's messages changed tone again. Where earlier they'd been defensive, now they edged toward concern. Can we talk in person? This is getting blown out of proportion. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I understood something she didn't. Once a process like this begins, it doesn't pause for emotional appeals. It moves forward on its own momentum, guided by documentation rather than intention. That evening, I received a call from a professional involved in the review. They didn't share conclusions, only observations. Some representations didn't align. Some responsibilities had been inaccurately attributed. Certain statements made publicly could be considered misleading if not corrected. Corrected. That word carried weight. Corrected meant acknowledging error. It meant revising narratives that had gone unchallenged for years. It meant Emily would have to face the difference between what she believed and what could be proven. By nightfall, Emily stopped messaging altogether. The silence felt different this time. Not dismissive, not superior, uncertain. I sat alone in my living room, the lights low, letting the reality settle in. This wasn't victory. It wasn't even resolution yet. It was accountability beginning to take shape. And for someone like Emily, someone who had always relied on confidence to outrun consequence, that was terrifying. The next morning would make that clear. Because once truth enters a room through formal channels, it doesn't leave quietly. It stays. It asks questions. It demands answers. And by then, Emily would understand that the story she'd told in front of her friends, the one meant to shrink me, had done the opposite. It had brought light to places she'd never expected anyone to look. The morning everything shifted, I didn't wake up to shouting or accusations. I woke up to silence. Not the familiar dismissive silence I'd known most of my life. The kind that erased problems by pretending they didn't exist, but a heavier one. A silence filled with anticipation, like a held breath. I was halfway through my coffee when my phone rang. It was Emily. I stared at the screen longer than necessary before answering. Not because I was afraid of what she'd say, but because I already knew the tone would be different. And I was right. She didn't start with anger this time. Did you know this was coming? She asked, her voice tight, controlled in a way that betrayed panic beneath it. Know what? I replied calmly. She exhaled sharply. I got an email this morning. They want documentation. Clarifications. They're asking about things from years ago. She paused, then added, they're saying some of what I said doesn't line up. There it was, the first crack. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let her sit with the reality that for once I wasn't going to guide her through it. After a few seconds, she continued. I mean, this has to be a mistake, she said quickly. You know how paperwork gets messed up. People misunderstand things all the time. I looked out the window at the street below, watching a neighbor walk their dog like it was any other morning. I don't think they're confused, I said. They're just checking. That's the same thing, she snapped, then caught herself. Her voice softened. Listen, if I said something wrong the other night, we can talk about it. Privately. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Because what Emily didn't understand, what she had never been forced to learn, was that private conversations only work when both people have equal footing. When one person controls the narrative, privacy becomes a shield. I don't think this is about the other night anymore, I said. There was a long pause. What do you mean? She asked. I mean, I replied, choosing my words carefully, that the other night didn't create this. It just revealed it. She went quiet again. I could hear her breathing uneven now. You're really doing this, she said finally. You're letting this blow up. I didn't correct her. Because from her perspective, it probably did feel like something was exploding. Years of assumptions, suddenly under pressure. A version of herself she'd never had to defend, now being examined. But from where I stood, nothing was blowing up. It was settling. I'm not doing anything, I said. I'm letting it move forward. She laughed once, sharp and humorless. You always say things like that, like you're not involved. I am involved, I replied. That's why it matters. She didn't respond. The call ended shortly after, not with a goodbye but with resignation. By late morning, messages started reaching me through other channels. A cousin asking what was going on. An aunt suggesting we keep family matters private. My mother called again, her voice strained. Your sister is really upset, she said. She feels blindsided. I closed my eyes briefly. She wasn't blindsided when she spoke about me in front of strangers, I said quietly. That's different, my mother insisted. That was just talk. I let the silence stretch this time. Talk has consequences, I said eventually. Especially when it's not true. She didn't argue. Not because she agreed, but because she didn't know how to counter that statement without admitting something she'd avoided for years. That afternoon, the first formal request arrived, forwarded to me by the professional overseeing the process. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't accuse anyone. It simply outlined discrepancies and requested explanations supported by documentation. I read it slowly. Every line was neutral, every question precise. There was nowhere to hide. I didn't forward it to Emily. She already had her own copy. I didn't need to watch her react in real time. I didn't need to be part of that moment, but I imagined it anyway. I imagined her sitting at her desk, scrolling, realizing that confidence couldn't substitute for records. That charm couldn't override timelines. That laughing something off didn't make it disappear once it was written down. For the first time in her life, she was facing a situation where being loud wouldn't help. That evening, she showed up at my door. Unannounced. I saw her through the peephole, standing stiffly, her posture unfamiliar. She wasn't dressed for performance, no carefully curated outfit, no practiced ease. She looked smaller somehow, tired. I opened the door. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Can we talk? She asked quietly. I stepped aside and let her in. She didn't sit right away. She paced once, then stopped, folding her arms like she was holding herself together. I didn't know, she said. About some of this. I really didn't. I waited. I mean, I knew you handled things, she continued. But I didn't think it mattered. I didn't think anyone would ever question it. There it was again, not remorse, but surprise. Surprise that the system had rules she couldn't bend. You said things about me that weren't true, I said evenly. She flinched. I was joking. In front of people who didn't know me, I replied. About things that affect my life. Her shoulders sagged slightly. I didn't think you'd do this, she said. I didn't either, I answered honestly. She looked up at me then, eyes searching my face, not for forgiveness, but for reassurance. For a sign that this would pass, that I would step in and fix it like I always had. I didn't give her one. Is there anything you can do? She asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I considered the question carefully. I've already done everything I need to, I said. The rest isn't up to me. She stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. Not yet. When she left, the house felt strangely peaceful. That night as I lay in bed, I thought about how quickly roles can reverse when truth enters the room. How someone who's spent their life standing tall can feel unsteady the moment the ground beneath them shifts. Emily had spent years believing I was small. By morning, she was learning what it felt like to be exposed, not by cruelty, not by revenge, but by reality, and reality once acknowledged doesn't ask permission. The meeting was scheduled for mid-morning in a glass-walled conference room downtown, neutral territory chosen intentionally. No family home advantage, no emotional shortcuts, just a space designed for clarity and accountability. I arrived early, not because I was anxious, but because I wanted a moment to sit with the reality of what was happening. Sunlight filtered through the windows, casting clean lines across the polished table. A car horn sounded somewhere below. Life outside continued, unaware that years of quiet imbalance were about to be addressed inside this room. Emily arrived 10 minutes late. She always had. Normally that wouldn't have mattered. But today, punctuality carried meaning. Process notices details people usually ignore. She walked in quickly, eyes scanning the room, shoulders tense. Our parents followed behind her, visibly uncomfortable, as if proximity alone might soften whatever was coming. Then the others entered. A lawyer representing the reviewing office, a compliance officer, and one neutral authority figure whose role was simply to ensure the discussion stayed factual and documented. No raised voices, no emotional framing, just questions and answers on record. Emily took a seat across from me. She didn't look at me. The meeting began without ceremony. The lawyer outlined the purpose of the session to clarify discrepancies between public representations and documented responsibilities over a multi-year period. He emphasized that this was not a personal dispute, it was a matter of record alignment. Emily nodded too quickly. As the questions started, the room shifted. They weren't accusatory. They were specific. Can you explain this email chain from 3 years ago? Why does this document list a different responsible party than the one you described publicly, when you stated X? Were you aware of Y? At first, Emily answered confidently. She spoke the way she always had assured Fluid, dismissive of details she didn't consider important. She leaned on phrases like, as far as I remember, and that was just how it worked back then. But memory doesn't stand up well against documentation. Each time she answered, a corresponding record appeared on the screen. Emails with timestamps, signed forms, notes from meetings she hadn't attended. The gaps between her version and the evidence grew wider, harder to bridge. Her confidence began to falter. She glanced toward our parents, once searching for reinforcement. My mother shifted uncomfortably. My father stared at the table. Then the focus turned to me. I was asked to confirm timelines, to verify responsibilities I had assumed, to explain decisions I'd made quietly without credit because they needed to be made. I answered simply, yes, no, that's correct. I didn't elaborate unless asked. I didn't editorialize. I didn't look at Emily, because this wasn't a performance. At one point, the authority figure paused the discussion and summarized what had been established so far. He spoke calmly, clearly, and without judgment. There was a pattern of misattribution. There were public statements that did not align with records. There were responsibilities transferred without acknowledgement. The room was silent. Emily's face had lost its color. Her hands were clenched in her lap, knuckles pale. This wasn't the kind of attention she was used to. This was scrutiny that couldn't be charmed away. This doesn't make sense, she said suddenly, her voice sharp with strain. I didn't mean to misrepresent anything. Intent isn't the same as impact. The lawyer acknowledged her statement, then returned to the facts. He explained the implications of inaccurate public claims, how they affected accountability, how they could not simply be dismissed as misunderstandings once documented. Our parents looked stunned. I realized then that this was the first time they were seeing the full picture, not filtered through family narratives, not softened by loyalty. They were watching a neutral process do what they never had: hold both of us to the same standard. As the meeting progressed, the conclusion became unavoidable. Corrections would need to be made. Public statements would need to be clarified. Responsibilities would need to be formally reassigned and acknowledged. Emily swallowed hard. What does that mean? She asked quietly. It means, the authority figure replied, that the record must reflect reality. That was the moment everything changed. Not because Emily was punished, not because I was vindicated in some dramatic way, but because the hierarchy she'd relied on, where her word outweighed mine, ceased to exist in that room. We were equals under review. The meeting ended with next steps outlined clearly. Deadlines. Required actions. No ambiguity. As people stood to leave, Emily finally looked at me. Her eyes were wide, not angry now, not dismissive. Afraid. In the hallway, away from the conference room, she reached for my arm. Please, she said, her voice breaking. Can we talk? I stopped walking. This time there was no audience, no advantage, no leverage. I don't want this to ruin everything, she said quickly. I didn't think it would go this far. I met her gaze steadily. It didn't go far, I said. It went accurate. She shook her head, tears forming. I didn't know you kept all of that. I didn't know I'd need it, I replied. Our parents hovered a few steps away, unsure whether to intervene. For once, they stayed silent. Is there any way to stop this? Emily asked. I thought about it. I thought about the night she'd laughed while strangers judged me based on her words. About how easy it had been for her to turn my life into entertainment. About how long I'd been expected to absorb discomfort so she could remain comfortable. No, I said gently. There isn't. Her shoulders sagged. She nodded slowly, as if something inside her had finally given way. By the time we parted, the outcome was clear, even if the process wasn't finished yet. The truth had been spoken in a space where it mattered. It had been heard by people who would act on it. And for the first time, I wasn't walking away diminished. I was walking away intact. That afternoon, Emily sent a message. I'm sorry, it read. I never thought silence meant strength. I didn't respond right away. Because apologies offered under pressure are complicated. Because some realizations need time to settle before they become genuine. But I knew one thing with certainty. The version of me she had shamed in front of her friends no longer existed. And the version of her who could speak without consequence had just met something she couldn't laugh off. The record. The begging didn't start right away. For the rest of that day, Emily stayed quiet. No texts, no calls, no attempts to soften what had happened with humor or nostalgia. I could tell she was processing not emotionally but strategically, trying to understand how something she'd always controlled had slipped beyond her reach. That night my phone rang just after midnight. I didn't answer. It rang again a few minutes later. Then again. By the fourth call I picked up. "I can't sleep," she said the moment I answered. Her voice was unsteady, stripped of the confidence I'd known my entire life. "I keep replaying everything." I sat on the edge of my bed listening. "I didn't realize how bad it looked," she continued. "I didn't think anyone would ever line it all up like that." "That's what records do," I said quietly. "They don't forget." She laughed weakly. "You always did like details." I didn't respond. There was a pause, then her voice dropped. "I'm scared." It was the first honest thing she'd said. I closed my eyes, not in satisfaction, not in triumph, but because hearing that fear forced me to confront something I'd avoided all my life. Emily wasn't just reckless. She was protected. And now that protection was gone. They're going to make me correct everything she said. Publicly. They said it has to be clear. "Yes," I replied. "That'll ruin my reputation," she whispered. I thought about how easily she'd risked mine. I don't want to lose everything she said. I worked hard for what I have. I almost interrupted her then. Almost reminded her how much of what she claimed as work had rested on invisible support, on my quiet labor, my compliance, my silence. Instead, I let her speak. "I shouldn't have talked about you like that," she said finally. I crossed a line. That was closer to an apology than I'd ever received from her. But it still wasn't the whole truth. "You didn't just cross a line," I said. "You assumed there wasn't one." She inhaled sharply. "Can you help me?" she asked. "Please." The word hung between us. Help had always flowed in one direction in our relationship. I helped by staying quiet, by smoothing things over, by carrying weight no one saw, by making sure Emily never had to look closely at the cost of her confidence. This time was different. "What does helping look like to you?" I asked. She hesitated, talking to them, explaining, maybe contextualizing things. I understood immediately. She wanted me to reframe the truth so it felt softer, more forgiving, less definitive. "I won't lie," I said. "I'm not asking you to," she replied quickly. "Just don't push." "I'm not pushing," I said. "I'm not pulling either." She started crying then, not loud dramatic sobs but quiet controlled tears that slipped through despite her efforts to contain them. "I didn't know you felt this way," she said. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how often that sentence had been used to erase responsibility. Not knowing doesn't undo harm. Not asking doesn't excuse it. "I tried to tell you," I said, "in ways you were willing to hear." She went silent again. The next morning she showed up at my place. This time she knocked softly. I opened the door to find her standing there. Eyes red, shoulders hunched, her usual polish gone. She looked younger somehow, smaller. Like someone who'd finally reached the end of their certainty and found nothing solid waiting. "I'll do whatever they ask," she said before I could speak. "I'll correct it. I'll acknowledge it. I don't want you to hate me." I stepped aside and let her in. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd spent years sorting through quiet decisions no one noticed. Sunlight streamed in, illuminating every detail. There was no hiding here. "I don't hate you," I said honestly. "But that doesn't mean things go back." She nodded quickly. I know that." Then, slowly, carefully, she reached across the table. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not just for the party. For everything." I studied her face, looking for signs of performance. For the familiar confidence slipping back into place. I didn't see it. What I saw was someone confronting consequences for the first time. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," she added. "I'm asking you not to abandon me." That was the moment that tested me. Because for years I had been the one asking silently, indirectly, not to be abandoned by my own family. I'd asked by staying agreeable, by being useful, by being invisible. Now the roles had reversed. "I'm not abandoning you," I said. But I'm not shielding you either. She nodded, tears spilling freely now. I deserve that. We talked for hours not about feelings but about reality, about what would need to be corrected, about what couldn't be undone, about how things would look moving forward. At one point she asked quietly, "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I considered the question carefully. "Because you never needed me to," I said, "until now." When she left that afternoon, she hugged me tightly like she was afraid I might disappear. I let her, but I didn't hold on. That night, the formal corrections were submitted. Statements revised, responsibilities acknowledged, records updated. By morning, the narrative had shifted publicly. Emily's reputation didn't collapse, but it changed. People noticed the corrections. Questions circulated. The certainty she once wielded softened into caution. And me, for the first time, I wasn't the quiet one absorbing the impact. I was the reference point. Emily texted me once more that morning. "Thank you for not destroying me." I stared at the message for a long time before replying. I didn't build the truth, I typed. I just stopped carrying it alone. The formal decision came 3 days later. Not with spectacle, not with confrontation. Just an email, precise, unemotional, impossible to misinterpret. It outlined the findings clearly in language that left no room for ambiguity. Responsibilities had been misrepresented. Credit had been publicly claimed without factual basis. Corrections had been accepted, but accountability would be noted going forward. There were no villains named, no dramatic condemnations, just a record clean, factual, permanent. I read it once, then again. What surprised me wasn't relief. It was how little I felt the need to react at all. No rush of triumph, no desire to share the outcome. Just a quiet settling, like something heavy finally placed down after being carried too long. Emily called an hour later. "I got it," she said. Her voice was steady but subdued. The edge she'd once worn like armor was gone. "It's official now." "Yes," I replied. "They said it won't escalate further as long as everything stays accurate," she continued. "But it's on record." "It should be," I said. She sighed. I didn't realize how much I'd built on assumptions. I let that statement stand. This wasn't the time to dissect it, to extract meaning or intent. The truth had already done its work. Later that afternoon, my parents came over. They sat on opposite ends of the couch, closer to each other than they'd ever been to me. The posture said everything: defensive unity built from discomfort rather than understanding. My father spoke first. "We didn't know," he said, "about the extent of it." I nodded. "I know." My mother looked at her hands. "We thought you were fine. You never complained." "I learned early that complaining didn't change anything," I replied. There was a long silence. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "We should have paid more attention. It wasn't a perfect apology. It wasn't even complete. But it was something I'd never expected to hear." "I don't need you to fix the past," I said gently. "I just need the future, to be honest." They nodded. Slowly. Cautiously. Like people adjusting to a reality they hadn't planned for. That evening, Emily sent another message. Not a plea, not an apology, just an observation. "People are treating me differently." I understood what she meant. Not cruelly, not dismissively, just with a little more distance, a little more caution, the kind that appears when certainty fades. "That's what accountability does," I replied. She didn't respond right away. When she did, it was hours later. I never thought silence could be this loud. I stared at the message for a long time. Neither had I. Over the next few days, the ripple effects became clearer. Conversations shifted. Invitations changed tone. People who once deferred to Emily now asked more questions. People who had barely noticed me before started seeking my input, not because they felt sorry for me, but because the record showed I had been present, reliable, and accurate all along. It wasn't validation I'd craved. It was alignment. For years, there had been a gap between who I was and how I was perceived. That gap had allowed others to step into my space to define me without resistance. Now that gap had closed, not because I demanded recognition, but because truth had made it unavoidable. Emily and I met once more that week in a quiet cafe halfway between our apartments. No tension, no drama, just two people adjusting to a new balance. "I don't expect things to go back," she said, stirring her coffee slowly. "And I know I can't undo what I did." "I'm not asking you to," I replied. She looked up at me. "Do you think we can rebuild?" I considered the question carefully. "I think we can rebuild something," I said. "But it won't look like before." She nodded. "That's fair. We sat in silence for a while, watching people pass by the window, strangers carrying their own unseen stories. For the first time, Emily didn't fill the space with words. She let it be. That more than anything else felt like change. When I got home that night, I opened the drawer in my office where the folders had lived for years. I didn't throw them away. I didn't need to. I simply closed the drawer gently and locked it. Not because I was afraid. Because I was done preparing for a fight I no longer needed to fight. The humiliation that had once defined me had lost its power. It had been exposed, contextualized, corrected. What remained was something quieter and stronger. Perspective. I understood now that my silence had never been weakness. It had been endurance. Unrecognized, undervalued, but real. And when paired with truth, that endurance became authority. Emily had begged me not to let the truth destroy her. It hadn't, but it had changed her, and it had freed me. I went to bed that night without replaying conversations, without anticipating conflict. For the first time in a long time, my mind was still. Because justice hadn't arrived with noise or spectacle. It had arrived with accuracy. And accuracy, once established, doesn't need defending. The quiet that followed felt unfamiliar at first. Not empty, just unoccupied. For most of my life, silence had been something imposed on me. A space where my thoughts stayed unspoken, where my reactions were edited before they ever reached my mouth. But now the silence around me felt different. It wasn't a constraint. It was room. Room to decide what came next. In the weeks after everything settled, I noticed how my days began to change in small, almost imperceptible ways. My phone buzzed less often with anxious messages. Family conversations became shorter, more careful. When Emily spoke to me, she chose her words with intention instead of assumption. It wasn't warmth, it was respect. That distinction mattered. At a family gathering a month later, one of those obligatory dinners we'd all once treated as performance, I arrived without the familiar knot in my stomach. Emily was already there, speaking quietly with our parents. When she saw me, she didn't launch into a story or fill the room with energy. She simply nodded. "Hey," she said. "Hey," I replied. That was it. No spotlight, no subtext, no hierarchy. I sat at the table and listened as conversations unfolded. When someone asked about work, Emily didn't answer for me. When a story brushed close to old territory, she redirected without prompting. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't performative. It was intentional. Later that evening, my mother pulled me aside. "You seem different," she said carefully. "Lighter." "I feel aligned," I replied. She nodded slowly, like someone absorbing a truth that couldn't be argued with. "I wish we'd seen you sooner." I didn't respond to that. Because the truth was, I didn't need to be seen sooner anymore. What mattered was that I could see myself clearly now, without distortion, without apology. Emily and I didn't become close again. Not in the way people imagine reconciliation. There were no long emotional conversations, no dramatic confessions that tied everything up neatly. What we built instead was something quieter. Boundaries. When we talked, it was direct. When we disagreed, it didn't turn into performance. When she slipped into old habits, interrupting, assuming, narrating, I didn't argue. I corrected. Once, calmly, and she adjusted. The power of that still surprised me. Not because she changed instantly, but because she recognized that I would no longer absorb discomfort for her sake. The old system didn't work anymore. And without an audience, it lost its appeal. One afternoon, weeks later, I found myself walking past the same neighborhood where Emily had hosted that gathering. The memory surfaced unexpectedly, the laughter, the heat in my face, the moment I'd stepped outside and realized something fundamental had shifted. I stopped for a moment on the sidewalk. That version of me, the one standing silently while being reduced, felt distant now. Not erased, not denied. Integrated. I didn't resent that person. I honored them. Because endurance isn't something you discard once justice arrives. It's something that carries you there. People often imagine standing up for yourself as a loud moment, a confrontation, a declaration, a turning point marked by raised voices. But that hadn't been my experience. My turning point had been quiet. It had been choosing accuracy over approval, process over performance, truth over timing. And that choice had changed everything. Emily sent me a message one evening that caught me off guard. "I'm trying to listen more," it read. "Not just to you, to everyone." I didn't know if it would last. Growth rarely follows a straight line, but for the first time I didn't feel responsible for guiding her through it. "Good," I replied simply. That was enough. As the months passed, the story lost its sharp edges. It became something people referenced less often, something that no longer defined interactions. The humiliation that once felt all-consuming faded into context, no longer the center of the narrative. What remained was something steadier: agency. I made decisions without bracing for backlash. I spoke when I needed to, stayed quiet when I chose to, not because silence was safer but because it was sufficient. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. The truth had already done that work for me. One evening I opened my laptop and reread the original email that had started the process. It struck me how unremarkable it looked now. No emotion, no drama, just a request for clarity. Clarity had been all I'd ever wanted. I closed the laptop and stepped outside, breathing in the evening air. The city hummed around me, indifferent and alive. I felt grounded in a way I hadn't before, rooted not in validation, but in alignment. Emily had once shamed me in front of her friends because she believed my silence made me small. She had been wrong. Silence had been my restraint, my preparation, my way of seeing clearly while others performed. And when the moment came, I didn't need to raise my voice. I let the truth speak. Now, when I think back to that night, I don't feel anger. I don't feel regret. I feel gratitude. Gratitude for the moment that finally forced me to stop carrying things alone. Gratitude for the realization that dignity doesn't demand an audience. It just demands consistency. I wasn't loud. I wasn't dramatic. I didn't win by overpowering anyone. I stood still. And in standing still, anchored in truth, protected by process, I finally stood upright. Not above anyone. Just fully, unmistakably myself. There's a lesson I didn't learn quickly, and maybe that's why it stayed with me so deeply. Silence is not the absence of strength, it's often where strength is stored. For a long time, I believed that being quiet meant being overlooked, that not defending myself meant I was losing. But life has a way of teaching us that noise isn't the same as power, and confidence isn't the same as truth. Sometimes the people who speak the loudest are the ones most afraid of being examined, and sometimes the people who endure quietly are the ones building something unshakable inside. What changed everything for me wasn't anger or revenge. It was clarity. It was choosing honesty over approval, accuracy over applause. I learned that you don't have to explain yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you, and you don't have to perform pain to prove it's real. Real dignity doesn't rush. It waits. And when the moment comes, it stands on its own. If you've ever been underestimated, talked over, or reduced to a version of yourself that wasn't true, this story is for you. Not to teach you to fight louder, but to remind you that your truth doesn't expire just because someone else ignored it. It only waits for the right moment to be seen. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share where you're watching from and what this lesson means in your own life. And if you believe in stories about quiet strength, delayed justice, and finding your footing again, please consider subscribing. You belong here.